when spirit and matter collide in the search for true empiricism. George Berkeley's subjective idealism as the logical consequence of Lockean epistemology. In this presentation, we will be studying the relationship between the thought of the Anglican bishop George Berkeley and John Locke's epistemology as outlined in his essay concerning human understanding. When observing the similarities and differences between Locke and Berkeley, one might notice that both of these thinkers are sense empiricists. Yet there remains a fundamental difference between them. In the end, Locke's sense empiricism takes a materialist position, where he affirms the objective properties of primary qualities which inhere in objects existing outside of the mind of the perceiver. Berkeley, on the other hand, takes an immaterialist position known as empirical or subjective idealism, in which the objective reality of matter existing outside of a perceiving being is rejected. What is particularly important for our considerations is to show how Berkeley's empirical idealism is actually the logical consequence of Locke's project. Locke maintained the existence of a material substance in his distinction between primary and secondary qualities. But Berkeley objects that this does not follow if one is to begin theorizing where Locke actually starts his epistemology. Furthermore, Berkeley's objection, although largely directed towards Locke, is an overall rejection of 17th century materialism. Out of this protest against materialism, Berkeley proceeds to form an argument which emphasizes spirit, while denying the existence of material substance. In order to understand how Berkeley comes to his position of empirical or subjective idealism, we will need to first locate Berkeley's thought in the historical development of ideas, most especially with respect to the dilemma which John Locke's thought poses to him. John Locke presents an empiricist epistemology influenced largely by the Newtonian worldview of abstract materialism and based primarily on sense perception. Locke is a sense empiricist, meaning that he sees all intelligibility as being derivative from the senses. The core idea is that human beings are born into the world as a blank slate, a tabula rasa, in which only sense perception and experience of the world contributes to human knowledge. In this perspective, all knowledge is ultimately reducible to the senses. All knowledge exists with reference to sense perception. On the basis of this view, a very significant term for our discussion arises. That is the notion of idea, which is crucial to understanding Locke's empirical stance. Really, what human beings are aware of is the idea of a thing. Most people would suggest that we have knowledge of things in themselves. But from Locke's perspective, the object of awareness is the idea of a thing. In other words, we do not have knowledge of things in and of themselves. Instead, we only have knowledge of our own idea of a thing derived from sensory perception. This is Locke's empirical starting point, which is in many ways a form of epistemological idealism. To say that all we have knowledge of is the idea of a thing might suggest that the only thing we can actually prove to exist is the idea in our minds itself, rather than the actual thing outside of us which we are perceiving. This leads to a great difficulty for Locke. Does our knowledge of ideas truly correlate with the actual objects of consideration outside of us? If I do not directly know objects outside of myself, but only know them indirectly through my ideas, then how do I know that my ideas of a thing are reliable representations? How do I know if they are true? At this point, Locke turns to what one might call a perspective of representational materialism, in which ideas are seen as the subjective reaction of the perceiver to the objects or bodies existing outside of him. This suggests that the objects or bodies outside of me have an objective reality which I can actually have knowledge of. My ideas are simply mental reconstructions or representations in my mind of the objects which exist outside of me. Locke's representationalism will become crucial to our consideration of Bishop Berkeley's subjective idealism, as this view insists there are objectively real material objects which our ideas make representations of. We will see that Berkeley wants to maintain the empirical starting point of Locke, which suggests that sense perception forms ideas in the mind, and the object of our knowledge is the idea itself, not an objective material thing outside of us. For Berkeley, Locke's error in thinking lies in his distinction between primary and secondary qualities, where Locke introduces the notion of some objectively real material substance. According to Locke, although material objects are only known indirectly, it must be the case that some aspects of our ideas of these objects which we perceive represent some objectively true qualities in the objects which are actually present in the material object itself. These he labels primary qualities, which include things like solidity, extension, motion, and number. These are the qualities which we have an accurate representation of in our ideas, which simultaneously exist in the object itself. But there are some other qualities of perception which Locke identifies as secondary qualities, which do not properly belong to the objects being perceived, but exist only in the mind. These qualities include sensory experiences, such as the experience of color, sound, or taste. It is this distinction between primary and secondary qualities in Locke's thought which Berkeley takes issue with. For Berkeley, Locke's acceptance of the concept that some subjective ideas are based on some objectively real material thing or body outside of the perceiver creates a dilemma. Berkeley's thought and trouble might be called the dilemma of representationalism. In his work, The Philosophy of Knowledge, Kenneth Gallagher points out that representationalism holds that ideas are caused by bodies, but are themselves subjective data. It overlooks the issue of how we may know the causal properties of bodies if we do not know bodies but only ideas. The dilemma, namely, is that Locke seems to have tainted the pure notion of idea. For Berkeley, the only knowledge we have is the idea which exists in our minds coming from sense experience. We never actually know the material bodies outside of ourselves. Berkeley's theory of subjective idealism, as expressed in the Principles of Human Knowledge and the dialogues between Hylas and Philonous, takes a position of immaterialism, which ultimately becomes a form of mentalism. Here, Berkeley rejects the notion of material substance, suggesting that all that exists in the mind. Berkeley's well-known expression, esse est percipi, suggests that to exist is to be perceived. All the various sensations or ideas that are imprinted on our senses, according to Berkeley, cannot exist except in a mind that perceives them. Thus, Locke's suggestion that we can truly have objective knowledge of primary qualities which exist in material things contradicts the subjectivism of a pure conception of idea. Ideas exist in the mind as subjective data based on sense perception. As Berkeley suggests, the objects of human knowledge are all ideas, and the various sensations or ideas that are imprinted on our senses cannot exist except in a mind that perceives them. In other words, according to Berkeley, there is no foundation for materialism and there is no foundation for representationalism in the Lockean sense either. For unthinking things, Berkeley says, to exist is to be perceived. So they couldn't possibly exist out of the minds or thinking things that perceive them. Representationalism suggests there is some body outside of the mind's perception which is true and real, independent of idea. But if one is to maintain the notion of knowledge as simply idea, as Locke sets out to do from the beginning of his epistemological theory, then one must logically conclude that all knowledge consists simply of ideas which exist only in the mind. For Berkeley, the error lies primarily in the desire to maintain an abstract notion of the existence of a material substance. In the Principles, Berkeley writes, "The supporters of matter themselves don't claim that there is any necessary connection between material things and our ideas. We could have all the ideas that we now have without there being any bodies existing outside us that resemble them. Evidently, then, we aren't compelled to suppose that there are external bodies as causes of our ideas." The notion that exterior bodies actually form ideas in the mind is empirically untenable according to Berkeley. It is probable that outside bodies do have an influence on the mind, but this is by no means certain. And the materialists themselves do not even truly understand how a material body might act on the spirit, allowing an idea to be imprinted on the mind in the first place. All in all, if materialists such as Locke reject the objective reality of secondary qualities of perception, such as color, sound, and taste, then why wouldn't they also reject the existence of primary qualities, such as extension, solidity, gravity, motion, and rest? In Berkeley's perspective, even these so-called primary qualities exist only in the mind. Berkeley makes a case for his position of immaterialism and mentalism as the logical consequence of John Locke's epistemological starting point, where it was proposed that the mind is a blank slate and that ideas are imprinted in the mind being the only source of human knowledge. In other words, we have no knowledge of anything outside of us. All knowledge is within our minds, being located in ideas. It is in the context of the dilemma of representational materialism, and especially in Locke's distinction between primary and secondary qualities, maintaining an objective place for the existence of a material substance, in which we can locate Berkeley's thinking. Berkeley's sense empiricism has no place for objectively real material substance. Rather, it is purely subjective, existing in the mind. Beyond Locke's thought, one must note that Berkeley is also engaged in an argument against philosophical materialism generally. Berkeley lived in a period of popularized notions of Newtonian physics, where abstract ideas of a fixed and mechanical universe had influenced philosophy. Furthermore, the continuing development of a materialist position in philosophy was occurring with the rise of new views on the notion of matter. Theories such as atomism and corpuscularianism were leading some to conclude that all that exists is simply made up of material particles. The abstract idea of a material substance was being employed to suggest that matter is fundamental to everything. In this view, material substance is what is important. Matter trumps any talk of spirit. In fact, in materialist philosophy, any talk of spirit or God becomes entirely unnecessary. The materialist philosophy proposes a geometrical and mechanical universe which operates on its own accord without any divine intervention. Overall, the materialist turn in epistemology, and in philosophy generally, came to emphasize matter as the source of reality at the cost of all things spiritual. Those who still wanted to maintain a belief in God turned to deism, where God is no longer viewed as being sovereign over material creation. It is in this exaltation of matter and in the decline of spirit where we might locate Bishop Berkeley's primary objection. Indeed, Berkeley was a philosopher who objected Locke's epistemological conclusion as being incoherent with his original premise, but Berkeley was also a bishop who would have been concerned with the decline of the belief in God's sovereignty over nature and the rejection of spiritual considerations, which was a reality of the 17th and 18th centuries. In studying Berkeley's epistemology, therefore, we might trace his opposition to materialist philosophy and his opposition to Locke's epistemology, that is, with the emphasis on the material objectivity of primary qualities, all the way back to a more fundamental objection, which has to do with his religious and theological convictions. Ultimately, Berkeley is engaged in a battle against a deistic conception of God, which materialist philosophy presupposes. This is a view which suggests that the immaterial spirit is not actually active. Rather, humans inhabit a geometrical and mechanical universe where God is removed from creation as a watchmaker, a mere designer who does not intervene in his creation. Ultimately, this view leads to the demise of any conception of the immaterial spirit, which Berkeley saw as active and powerful. In this regard, Berkeley's position is theistic, as he desires to defend the pure and immaterial spirit in which all beings participate and all human perception finds its source. Berkeley's project is really an attempt to defend the existence of God in an age of radical materialism. Berkeley's epistemology, as expressed in the Principles and the Dialogues, actually seems to conclude as a forerunner to absolute idealism. It stresses the centrality of God, the immaterial spirit, in human knowledge. In the Principles, Berkeley writes, "Although matter is not perceived by us, it is perceived by God, and to him it is the occasion of causing ideas in our minds." This is why in Berkeley's thought, we can be assured that the table in our kitchen will continue to be in our kitchen even when we are away from our home at work. That particular table in my kitchen exists because it continues to be perceived in the mind of God. It is an idea which exists in the mind of God. If to exist is to be perceived, then for my kitchen table to continue to exist while I am out of the house on my daily routine, it must be continuously perceived by God. Berkeley suggests that this is actually what occurs. Anything which exists is ultimately perceived by God first, in which the subjective idea of a thing is maintained, and in which the occasion arises which causes ideas in the human mind. God is the infinite mind, the immaterial spirit which causes all ideas to come to me through perception. Ultimately, for Berkeley, it is God who is the source of all human knowledge. In this presentation, we have considered George Berkeley's refutation of John Locke's epistemology, in which Berkeley rejects Locke's representational materialism for a position of empirical or subjective idealism. Berkeley rejects Locke's epistemology on the basis of Locke's distinction between primary and secondary qualities, which do not seem to be consistent with Locke's initial premise that all knowledge comes from ideas which exist in the mind and come through sense perception. Even more significant, however, is Berkeley's opposition to the philosophical materialism of his day, against which he is trying to defend the existence of God and the place of the immaterial spirit in the order of the universe. For Berkeley, God must be the source of all human knowledge, which a materialist philosophy cannot grasp. For humans to have knowledge, Berkeley judges, they must actually participate in the immaterial spirit as the cause of all ideas that arise in the human mind.